So many thanks for coming along tonight, both in our audience here in Sydney and on our Zoom call, and others will be on. So we're having a discussion tonight titled "What's Treasurer Jim Chalmers on?" It relates to the Treasurer's essay in the Monthly, in the February edition of the Monthly, and we have two views being expressed. Both our speakers will go for about 15 minutes each, and then we'll have questions and discussion and finish at the top of the hour. So we'll lead off with Sam Crosby, who's Executive Director of the St Vincent de Paul Society in New South Wales. He's a Fellow of the McKell Institute. He's the author of The Trust Deficit and Other Things. And Dimitri Burshtein, who's a former officer of the New South Wales Treasury Department and a contributor to Australian. So we'll lead off with Sam, we'll go to Dimitri, and then questions and discussion. Let's go.
Well, thanks, Gerard. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional lands on which we meet, and pay my respects to their elders, both past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank Gerard for the invitation to have me here today. At the end of the day, the world is run on little else other than ideas. And for decades now, Gerard and Anne have been peerless in providing a platform for all manner of ideas. Some good, some bad, but they do not distinguish, which I, for one, am very thankful of. So thank you for having me, Gerard. He called me a couple of weeks ago to ask if I'd come and defend Jim's essay in the Monthly. Now, since I left the McKell Institute, headed to a not-for-profit, headed to Vinnie's, I don't really do terribly many speeches, and I don't really do terribly many political speeches at that. But I felt that I had to defend Jim, not just because I consider him my friend, though I do, to be fair, and not just because I want to encourage public officials to articulate and enunciate and think through their ideas and put them out in long form, but I do. I wanted to come here and defend his article and his essay because, very simply, I agree wholeheartedly with his proposition. And his proposition is this, that governments have a role to intervene in markets and direct them towards social goods. The proposition says that if markets, if left to their own devices without government signals or government directions, are ill-equipped to answer many of the challenges that Jim sets out in his essay. Challenges such as climate change, aged care, skills, training, women's participation in the economy. These challenges haven't and won't solve themselves. Now, I arrive at this conclusion despite being a leftist, not because of some sort of fetish for busybody bureaucrats poking their noses in people's business where they don't belong. I support government intervention despite not knowing the words to Solidarity Forever or even owning a single copy of Das Kapital. In fact, the things I admire most about liberalism and the liberal tradition is the idea that government should play as small a role in people's lives as possible. Now, there was a little caveat there for anyone wanting to watch and play this back at home. I arrive at the conclusion that supports government's role in rounding off the harshest edges of the market because I see daily what happens when they don't. Working at Vinnie's, I'm exposed to the market's failure every single day in caring for its most vulnerable citizens. Now, when you open up the domain section of the Sydney Morning Herald and you read and you see houses that are selling for tens and twenties, millions of dollars, when you open up the AFR and you see examples of well-paid bureaucrats defending excessive compensation packages, and then you get a call from a mother who has been living in her car for over a year because she can't afford a rent increase. When you see a government program providing prison retraining packages that had been wonderfully successful cut because they did not have the money to continue, you can't see these juxtaposition and think that everything in our society is going along well and the market is operating as it should. In thinking about today and today's speech, I stumbled across one of Dimitri's op-eds in The Australian. He told me there was another one, which if I'd researched a little bit closer, I possibly would have found, but still. The title was "Jim's Capitalism Will Leave the Nation Broke or Worse." Ooh, sinister. Now, the central point of criticism, and I understand Dimitri's going to perhaps be a little bit lighter than he was in his article, is Jim's articulation of values-based capitalism. Now, in this opus, Dimitri hits the trifecta. He manages to link Jim's, I think, relatively benign idea with MMT, neo-oligarchies, and of course, a threat to democracy itself. I can almost hear the tanks running down Northbourne Avenue with the soldiers carrying copies of the Monthly and the Saturday paper in their breast pocket. But unfortunately, here's the truth. Jim's idea of infusing capitalism with values isn't new. As much as the terribly earnest undergrad in me and the poli-sci student in me might like it to be some sort of brave new political philosophy, the truth is it's just not new. Jim tells us as much when he quotes John Maynard Keynes saying that we are all slaves to some defunct economist. These ideas have been had before. And if I can preempt Dimitri's rejoinder, it's not a throwback to the USSR or Venezuela or any other geopolitical buzzword that will no doubt elicit a terribly emotional response and get this crowd's heart racing. Its values-based capitalism is squarely heir to third-wave progressivism, to the Hawke and Keating governments of the 1980s and 1990s. Remember, it's Hawke and Keating that showed the world, and centre-left parties around the world, that the rawest and most unbridled form of capitalism as prosecuted by Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s was not the only way. They showed us that you can reform the economy whilst ensuring that your safety net is strong enough to capture those who fall victim to economic shocks or technological changes. Superannuation, the price and income accords, enterprise bargaining, HECS, Medicare, the list is long and historic. In each of these instances, the government intervened in the market and directed it towards a better goal, informed by values of fairness and egalitarianism. It was the values-based capitalism of the 1980s. The ideas that markets are imperfect and need government's help to direct and harness them are straight out of Keating's playbook. And you know what else? So is the step that's one step away from communism. We've seen that before. Read through the speeches of the opposition leader of the day, at the time decrying these ideas of socialism. Now, I'm painfully aware of whose house I'm standing in, and I'm not going to criticise those speeches anymore for fear that the author is here among us. But still, it is now terribly fashionable to decry the models of any modern Labor government as deviating from the path of Hawke and Keating. But trust me when I say that these are very fairly and squarely in the mould of Keating himself. The question isn't government versus markets. Those sort of debates should be left to Fisher Library or, in my case, at least to Manning Bar. But the question should be how and when should governments involve themselves in the economy? John Howard, Mike Baird, they answered these questions in much the same way. They answered, however, with public and private partnerships in a similar way. They wanted to harness and use private capital and direct it in such a way as to answer the questions and the social needs of the day. Now, as I said, Jim is a friend, but I think moreover his attempt to provide some transparency to his thinking should be acknowledged and applauded. But let's have a chat about this later. Dimitri.
Thanks, Sam. Sorry. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming along tonight. I know Barry Humphries passed away last week, but those of you who are expecting me to come as... I've gone blank. Celeste Patterson, no, as... Anyway, forget about it. I'll save that joke for another time. Thanks also to Anne and Gerard for inviting me to speak tonight. I read somewhere sometime that the only pathways to immortality are to plant a tree, have a child, or to write a book. Now, 2 out of 3 for me, but perhaps I get some dispensation for giving a presentation at the Institute tonight. I myself have attended many an Institute presentation. One particular one comes to mind. It's from July 2015 in the offices of Clayton Utz, when the then Minister for Communication gave a very wide-ranging presentation on matters completely unrelated to his portfolio. 2 months later, that minister, Malcolm Turnbull, proceeded to launch his successful bid to be Prime Minister. So, Gerard and Anne, I'm looking forward to Jim Chalmers' presentation in the coming years. But speaking of Dr. Chalmers, as is the presentation tonight, what is he on about? I spent several years at university acquiring several degrees in economics, but I don't consider myself an economist. I'm more of the Joan Robinson school that believes the purpose of studying economics is to avoid being deceived and misled by economists. Treasurer Chalmers, on the other hand, does not have qualifications in economics. One does not need to be an economist to be a successful treasurer or to write about economics. Think Paul Keating, Peter Costello. But Chalmers' lack of economics training makes his 6,000-word essay in the Monthly all the more interesting. Just to set the scene, Chalmers' academic qualifications include a Bachelor of Arts, a Bachelor of Communications and a doctorate in political science. His thesis subject was Paul Keating. Some have suggested this is a good foundation for a Labor treasurer, perhaps, but Chalmers' thesis was not on Keating the treasurer, but Keating the Prime Minister. I've skimmed Chalmers' thesis, and in it he wrote, "Prime Ministers can choose to give speeches simply because it's expected of them, and many go through the motions of satisfying this requirement. Others use speech-making opportunities to set the agenda, to leave an historical mark and define the direction and objectives of government." Just to emphasise that, speeches to set the agenda and leave an historical mark. Although Chalmers is not Prime Minister, yet at least, it seems his essay on a new value-based capitalism for Australia was his attempt to set the agenda. To be fair to Chalmers, and I agree with Sam on this, it takes significant energy and effort to articulate a political and economic narrative. He followed it up with an explanatory opinion piece in the AFR, and just last month he had two op-eds the same day in two different newspapers, one on the state of the banking system, one on the state of the budget. Perhaps these later ones were the product of staff, but they still had his name and imprimatur. I think this is all important context because it signals not just what Chalmers is thinking from a policy perspective, but what are his ambitions. For me, the most concerning part about Chalmers' essay is the lack of a comprehensive reply from somebody from the coalition. Writing in The Australian last month, Greg Sheridan noted the general failure of conservative political parties to prosecute their case for conservative policies. We should thus not be surprised that the underlying economic narrative for Australia is one of a large, expensive, rapidly expanding and increasingly interventionist state, when few elected representatives are articulating an alternative, let alone prosecuting one. We have not heard a detailed economic vision or narrative from a coalition leader or Treasury spokesperson for a very long time. And as you know, you can't have a battle of ideas when there's only one team on the field. Although most of the current political oxygen is being taken up by The Voice, I remain hopeful that Shadow Treasurer Angus Taylor, as one of the few with significant commercial experience in the Parliament, will run onto the field at some stage, especially with the budget coming up, a budget that will likely have even more government spending and even more government taxing. In his essay, Chalmers seeks to describe a new version of capitalism, different to the one that got us here today. I just want to pause for a moment for people to consider how unnatural is capitalism from the start and how fortunate we are to have experienced capitalism in our lifetime. Modern humans have walked this earth for around 200,000 years. For almost all of that time, if I had some bananas and you had some apples and I wanted an apple, I'd just hit you in the head with a rock and take your apples. This is the secret source of capitalism: voluntary trade and exchange. Voluntary. In his Wealth of Nations book, Adam Smith observed that trade is one of the characteristics that distinguishes humans from animals. And it is this voluntary trade that has made us all wealthier, happier, and healthier. Government, in a broad sense, is just another means to take your apples with a rock. And Chalmers is not advocating for more trade, but for more government. In his essay, Chalmers presents his case for an even more active government. He argues for something he calls values-based capitalism that shows how far the economic Overton window has moved in the last 20 to 30 years, and is reflective of the broader economic policy ecosystem that surrounds our policymakers. This is an ecosystem that is populated by people who seldom have private sector experience or have witnessed double-digit unemployment. They may have read about a recession or the economic cancer that is inflation, but they've not really felt it. It is the members of this ecosystem that advocate for policies that sound good over policies that have been shown to do good. And its members seldom pay the price when they are wrong because, as Nassim Taleb has written, they lack skin in the game. It was from this ecosystem that not long ago re-emerged something called modern monetary theory. A nice sounding wrapper around the old practice of central banks creating money at a rate faster than economic growth. Just another theory to justify an ever larger state. I know Gerard will possibly, giggle at this one, but ABC business and economics reporter Gareth Hutchins wrote in March 2021, about 6 months before the RBA was blown out of the bond market and 14 months before the RBA's first post-COVID interest rate rise, he wrote, "We may be on the cusp of a revolution. What if everything we knew about public finance over the past 40 years has been wrong? A new economic theory has emerged that could rewrite our understanding of how governments create and spend money and what kind of society we can afford to build. Governments can costlessly create and spend as much as they want." Modern monetary theory counts a senior Australian academic as one of its contemporary champions, and its advocates, perhaps an advocate no more, include a former senior economic minister in the Gillard-Rudd governments. Although not calling it modern monetary theory, a current sitting LNP senator said in June 2021 that he wanted to speak to Barnaby Joyce, accountant, to get an infrastructure bank out of quantitative easing. Quantitative easing being the central bank euphemism for money printing to buy government bonds. Despite the ahistorical delusions of some, modern history has shown unequivocally that private property, rule of law, free markets, sound money, and limited government drive prosperity anywhere and everywhere. It lifts all boats. We have real-time case studies to evidence this. North Korea, South Korea. East Germany, West Germany. To an extent, North America, South America. It's not geography, it's not race, it's not government-directed investment, it's not money printing, modern monetary theory. It's the system through the values of free markets and free peoples engaged in voluntary trade and exchange. These are the values of classical capitalism which Chalmers suggests are not working and require change. But from where comes the intellectual origins of value-based capitalism? In Chalmers' essay, he paid homage to British-American economist Mariano Mazzucato in influencing his thinking. Mazzucato, who Prime Minister Albanese has also read and recommended, was an economic advisor to former British Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn. Yes, that Jeremy Corbyn. And her writings have been described by the Socialist Party of England and Wales as providing, quote, "a detailed exposé of the parasitic character of modern capitalism, drawing on Karl Marx's theory of the source of value creation." Somebody else has read Das Kapital, obviously. Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher read Hayek, Friedman, Buchanan, Nobel laureates. Albanese and Chalmers read Mazzucato, favourite of the Socialist Party of England and Wales. Chalmers has likely also been influenced by his former boss, Wayne Swan, who believes that income distribution is a problem in Australia and getting worse. This despite the data not supporting such a position. On the contrary, income inequality is measured through something called the Gini index, a measure of between 0 and 1. The higher the number, the worse is income distribution. According to the ABS, as in Australian Bureau of Statistics, the Gini index for Australia was 0.329 in 2010 and 0.324 in 2020. Yes, a small decline over 10 years. These lowish numbers compare favourably with such income equal nirvanas as Guatemala with 0.48, Namibia at 0.59, and Zimbabwe at 0.50. And according to my friend ChatGPT, the country with the lowest Gini index of 0.24 was Ukraine, likely because everyone there is poor. Referencing Mazzucato's work, Chalmers suggests our economic problems are caused not by markets, but by poorly designed markets. And it is the role of government to design and build markets in partnership with business and labour. But we've seen this movie before, and we continue to see it. Government designed and managed markets by a coalition of big government, big business, and big labour is generally called oligarchy. Nowhere in his essay does Chalmers define what or whose values would underpin his new capitalism, but he does hint towards the values of, and I quote, many forward business people and investors. Not the values of Labor's traditional base, the working class, or of small business, or of general Australians, but the values of the rent-seeking upper bourgeoisie, again from Das Kapital, who have access and proximity to government, also known as oligarchs. Don't get me wrong, I'm not advocating for anarchy. There is a valid role for government as a standard setter, enforcer of property rights, provider of a social safety net, defender of national security and provider of public goods. But our governments have moved well past these functions, well past. And Chalmers is looking to move us even further. Our governments of all persuasions no longer just provide a safety net. They provide a dual track of a safety net for some and a recreational hammock for others. Australia now has one of the largest and most sophisticated middle-class welfare systems in the world. I mean, childcare rebates for families earning more than $500,000 a year, sales tax discounts for expensive electric cars, cars that don't pay fuel excise, discounted pharmaceuticals for retired millionaires. In his essay, Chalmers suggests that the world has changed, warranting a greater role for government. This is based on his assessment that 3 so-called crises in 15 years had exposed vulnerabilities in our economic systems. The crises Chalmers identifies were the GFC, COVID and inflation, but all of these were in many respects government-made and amplified. I can talk to COVID separately if you like, but in the case of the GFC and inflation, as Thomas Sowell, one of my favourite writers and thinkers, wrote 40 years ago, as long as we keep expecting politicians to give us something for nothing, we should also continue to expect financial crises. The GFC was the byproduct of a corrupted regulatory system in the US, pushing banks to lend to people who could not afford home loans. And our current inflation is now, and has been throughout history, a function of government spending, too much money, printing to support it, and suppressing production. Now, I know this is not Parliament, so I'm allowed to use props. I carry these around to show people. This is a $20 trillion Zimbabwean note. This is a $10 trillion Zimbabwe note. Zimbabwe's hyperinflation did not happen because of COVID, because of the war in Ukraine. It was caused by the Zimbabwean government destroying agricultural production, spending too much money, and then undertaking modern monetary theory to pay the salaries of public servants and associated cronies. For all the cries of evil capitalism and trickle-down economics, the Commonwealth government spending as a percentage of GDP has increased from around 18% in 1972 to around 23% in 2020 to just under 28% in 2020. This is before COVID or the Ukraine war. Across the 3 tiers of Australian government, spending as a proportion of GDP currently sits between 40 and 50%, depending on how you count it. Whichever way you slice it, that's a lot of government. Our governments have also systematically re-regulated the economy over the last 20 years. The Australian Law Reform Commission even recently described the Australian Corporations Act as being in a class of its own for complexity. And this is before you get to the tax code. We should thus not be surprised that productivity is not improving and per capita GDP is going nowhere to backwards. What else should be expected when an increasing proportion of Australia's economic resources are moving from production to government and quasi-government activity? Creeping government intervention continues to damage Australia's competitiveness. Incitec Pivot did not move its fertiliser production plants to the United States because of deregulation. It moved because of Australia's high energy cost, high taxes and high regulation business environment. And now Australia imports some 95% of our urea fertiliser. For a nation that is theoretically energy and food independent, we import most of our fuel, most of our fertiliser, and most of our new electricity generation. It's no wonder we need to spend $370 billion on nuclear-powered submarines to secure our trade lanes. More than 30 years after the fall of the Soviet Union and 40 years since the start of the Hawke, Keating and Walsh, I emphasise Walsh reforms, Chalmers and many of his colleagues believe it's time to give active government and economic planning another go, to provide centralised management and guidance through what he described in his essay as reimagining and redesigning markets with coordination and co-investment. An example of government working with business and labour to reimagine and redesign markets, earlier this month it was reported that the Australian Hypnotherapists Association had hired a labour-aligned lobby firm to get things like GST exemptions, NDIS and Medicare recognition. What's next? The Association of Crystal and Hot Rock Therapists? This is the essence of the problem of Chalmers' essay. He is building a straw man of capitalism which does not exist, and which he can tear down to support his vision for an ever larger role for government. But history and data are not on his side. What Chalmers is proposing is just a further acceleration of the poor economic policies that continue to erode our national prosperity. The ideas may sound wonderful, but reality has a habit of not cooperating. And it was, sorry, if you expect him to come as Ayn Rand in drag, you'll be disappointed.
Yes. Oh, I don't know. So thanks to Sam and thanks to Dimitri for a lively discussion. We were going to give them both a taxi home, but it was going to be financed by the Zimbabwe government. Don't know you'll be able to carry it. All right, so look, we'll get you both up here. Can I remind everyone who hasn't done it, turn off their phone in case it's still on. No phones have gone off. Now you come around here, I'll go over here. Remember to adjust that. So if we just go back to, just move close together. Sam, yeah, you've got to speak into this microphone. So just to start off with Sam and then go to Dimitri. So Sam, what do you see the strength in Chalmers's article in the Monthly? What would you say the strength was, and the weakness in Dimitri's position, and the opposite? What would you say the strength, the weakness in Chalmers, and the weakness in Sam's position? You work it out. See, Sam, you just respond.
So you want the strength of Jim's?
Yep, and the weakness of Dimitri.
Okay. The strength of Jim's is I think he's had a crack at articulating how he and how the government should make decisions. In my book, I wrote one of the keys to trust in politics is transparency in decision making, so that you can preempt a decision, you can preempt that government idea before it happens. I think Jim's given it a stab in that. I love Dimitri's speech, and I think he was pretty right in articulating a lot of the problems. What I didn't hear were many solutions, other than government needs to get out of the way. And in some cases, I dare say that's correct, but he highlighted the GFC. He highlighted the collapse of regulatory reform before going on to bemoan the complex regulatory system in Australia. So what is it? Should we regulate more or should we regulate less? Surely the answer is that we have to regulate properly. We have to regulate according to our values. I don't think you can have a bet each way. That would be my criticism.
And Dimitri,
Look,
the weakness in what Sam's saying?
Well, I agree with much of what Sam says, and as I said, I think it takes a lot of courage and effort for somebody to go out there on the stage and say these things and put these things in writing to be debated. It's just my disappointment that there hasn't really been a debate. To some of the points that Sam made, no doubt there are people in this nation who are struggling, and I would rather public resources be directed to them than people with, $500,000 getting childcare rebates and subsidies for, electric cars and, discounted pensions. The problems are complex, but to your specific question about regulation, I'm not advocating for more or less. I'm talking about right regulation. And the way our regulatory environment has evolved is a failure of the political system. If the New South Wales Police were to come out and write policy papers advocating for changes to the criminal law, they'd be laughed out of town. They'd be told you're talking about, beyond your brief. Yet every day, our regulators, who have no interest in the marginal cost of additional regulations, constantly advocate for new and more complicated regulation. There is no trade-off in their minds because the system is not working. The problems are clear, the solutions are more complex, but to get to the solution, you actually have to start the conversation. I don't think those conversations have started.
Can I just take up?
What we're going to do, Sam, we're going to take this off.
Can I just take up one point about the welfare state and where do we bring in welfare, where do we stop welfare? It's easy to look at the $500,000 example and say, well, that's too much. And it's easy to look at the person earning $5,000, $10,000 a year and say, yes, they deserve some. What's much harder is trying to figure out where in the middle. Is $50,000 enough? Is $100,000 enough? That's a difficult point. I would just like to pose one idea. Hawke, in 1983, brought in Medicare. The idea that every single Australian would get access to a medical system, regardless if you're earning $500,000, $1 million, $100 million, or if you're on the age pension. And that idea, whilst I acknowledge was somewhat radical at the time, is one of the things that I love about this country because it puts us all on the same playing field. It stops dividing us between north and south or east and west, and it starts saying, no, we're all the same. We all have a strong safety net that we're eligible for. So I respect the view that perhaps some subsidies are too generous to some income demographics, sure. But I just think we need to think through what that does by expanding that social welfare net, obviously to the point that we can pay for it. That goes without saying.
Hawke also introduced the pension assets test because he said those who don't need it shouldn't get it. And that seems to have been lost in the conversation. With regard to Medicare, and I know we're going beyond the scope of the subject, there is a difference, to my mind, of government providing assistance to people to get access to healthcare from governments running healthcare. And I think that conversation needs to be had because, I referred to James Buchanan in my comments, the author of Public Choice Theory. I think, as you will have read in the last couple of months, the academic who wrote that, was it $8 billion of Medicare money is wasted? Again, I don't have a problem with the government spending the number it spends, but I don't want it poured down the toilet, and before they ask for more, they should fix what they're spending first.
Just go back to Sam for a minute. Just come up together. What you said about St Vincent de Paul Society was very interesting, but in a different time, half a century ago, there was probably less homelessness than there is now, I would think. And then the role of people like organisations like St Vida Peas was they got money and they gave it to people who needed it. So the woman you talk about in the car, if your organisation can give her money, that's probably a better way to getting the money to her than through lots of bureaucrats sitting in departments handing it out. So how do you see the role of government vis-a-vis an organisation not-for-profit like yours?
Great question. There is and I say this with a lot of love in my heart for Vinnie's. I was a member before I worked there. I dedicated all my free time to it. And now I work there. I want to do it professionally. There is a lack of dignity in having to come and ask for help. And a lot of people are brave enough that they can do that, and they can turn up to one of our centres and they can see our members and they can say, I'm struggling, I need help. And that's a wonderful thing. For everyone that comes and sees us, there are, thousands that don't. A government system of slightly more generous welfare payments, of New Start payments, means that doesn't happen. And the case study was during COVID, when the welfare payments were increased, we saw our numbers plummet. The number of people that would knock on our doors when the New Start payment was increased significantly plummeted. And that was the case for a number of different organisations such as ours. Fast forward onto I think it was the second lockdown in New South Wales, where New Start wasn't increased, and we saw our numbers skyrocket. So we know that there is a direct impact on that.
The question I have for both of you is around what you both agree is very important, and that is minimising government spending where possible. Telstra wrote off more than $30 billion. The Labor government has proposed 3 new entities, and I particularly think of the one you're talking about, housing, which has got some funny churn through the Future Fund. I think the total of them all is more than $30 billion. What I'm saying is something like housing for government, for people needing government support, should be in the budget. The other 2, I don't agree with them being in the same position that Telstra was when it started up. It was going to be profitable. It wasn't. The 3 that have been announced is going to be an unnecessary expense.
I think you're actually, not Telstra, but NBN, I think you're referring to.
I meant, yeah, sorry.
The 3 funds you're talking about is to turn the future fund into a leveraged hedge fund. They're basically borrowing money to give to the future fund to invest and then to recycle the proceeds of those investments into rewiring the nation. I think there was a manufacturing one as well, and the housing one, social housing. We can debate whether they're the correct policy pathways, but the pea and thimble trick of borrowing to give to the future fund to hope to expose Australian taxpayers to market risk is just, it's a very strange logic to my mind.
Look, I'm not going to comment on the economics of it. It's far beyond my remit. What I will say is this. That woman that I spoke of, you get these all the time. It's an incredibly common story. And they come through the door and you think to yourself, gee whiz, I've got to refer these on, and it's such a compelling case. They will absolutely get a house. They'll absolutely get on the top of the social housing list, and within a week they'll be in a house, no problem. And they're not. Sometimes they go on the list, a lot of times they go on the list and they sit there and they sit there and they sit there and they sit there. And you realise that all of the other people on the priority wait list have equally as compelling cases, equally as heartbreaking stories, but the number of them is just impenetrable. My point is that maybe the Future Housing Fund isn't the right way to go. I don't know, but it's something. And I've got to say, as someone in that sector who regularly makes calls to people to say, can we get this person on the priority wait list and can we get some action for them, I'm crossing my fingers and hoping that it goes through. I really am.
May I just add one more thing? The Commonwealth Government employs around 250,000 people. There are frontline service providers. There's the federal police. There's Home Affairs. There are frontline service people. The vast majority of them are not frontline service people. The payroll cost of these employees is about $25 billion. The CPSU is seeking a 20% pay increase. That translates in very simply to $5 billion a year. I would wonder how much social housing and income support to the low could be allocated at that expense. And I note also that Gerard's friends at the ABC got a 11% pay bump and $1,500 cash bonus.
The comrades think it's not enough.
Thank you. My question is probably mostly directed to Sam, but Dimitri, feel free to answer if however you want as well. Could you elaborate on how you see the cooperation between business and unions could build economic and political capital to fulfil many of the elements of Dr. Chalmers' value-based capitalism?
The cooperation between unions and government. Well, we've seen it. We saw it in the 1980s. We saw it in the 1990s. We saw the modern system of Medicare grow up as a result of that cooperation. Truth be told, I don't know what this next iteration looks like. That was at a time with centralised wage fixing of union density of 48, 49%. We're obviously not there anymore. So I don't know. I would say that even with unions' declining share of the labour market, they still represent around 2 million working Australians, which, as Dimitri points out, if you're going to listen to either, what was the line, bourgeois?
Can't recall. Upper bourgeoisie.
Upper bourgeoisie or regular working people, the Australian union movement provides a very good link to those regular rank and file policemen, nurses, workers of all shapes and varieties. I don't think we're going to see another accord like we did in the 1980s and 1990s. I don't think the cooperation, if you like, will take that shape, but we'll see.
I have nothing to add on that one.
Jonathan.
So many questions about the budget I could ask, so let me just ask this one. Australia's got the best terms of trade it's ever had in its history. We have the lowest unemployment for about 50 years, but the budget looks like it's going to have a serious deficit number. Isn't all this discussion a distraction from the job of the Treasurer to fix the budget at a time when it should be delivering, record surplus rather than more deficit?
Yes. It was covered in both it was possibly in the AFR as well, but it was both in the Sydney Morning Herald and the Oz, the Grattan Institute's Back in Black report, which offered a number of ideas, some of which would be described by Sir Humphrey as courageous, and they were highly skewed to the revenue side, highly skewed.
You just got to handle it that way.
Sure.
You're covering that.
Sure. In their report, they put up a chart that showed taxes across the OECD, and the clear implication was that Australia is a low tax jurisdiction. It's just not so. It's just not so. I think the number they said was that the average tax rate across the OECD was 28% and Australia was 25%. But when you add in all the other state and territory taxes, you account for superannuation, which other European countries tax for, but we take off budget, so to speak. Our tax rate's 40%, over 40%, across the three tiers of government. That puts us in the Scandinavian territory. Now, at least the Scandinavians have efficient and effective government. We have three tiers of confused, overlapped government. And I'm not sure that Australia's national competitiveness can withstand much more taxation. I don't know how much more our economy can withstand in taxation.
You want to comment on that?
Oh, look, only to say I agree to an extent. We've got $1 trillion of debt and deficit in this country. It's crazy. It's utterly crazy. Now, how are we going to repair that? You can't, as Joe Hockey famously said, do it in one cycle. You remember when he was opposition shadow treasurer and he said, we'll have a budget surplus year one and every year thereafter and then proceed to deliver none. It's rubbish, right? I think you're going to have to do it over time, and it's going to be a generation job to get over this debt and deficit emergency, as Tony Abbott described it before the Liberal government doubled it before COVID and then doubled it again during COVID. But it's going to be a long-run question.
This question on the back.
My question is principally for Sam. I was struck by what I'm seeking is an example of where government has designed a market well. And I was drawn when you used the housing example. Housing is a government-designed market. It's the most favoured tax regime. All the supply is constrained by government. There are first homeowners grants which skew the price, and then everyone's mystified as to why housing is unaffordable. So we have government-designed markets. There's a gap between what is intended and what works. I'm just wondering if you can give an example which works, because the government-designed markets I see, the lady in the car is affected by housing, by the Australian Energy Market Operator, which is a government-designed market, and even here with planning and certification, where the government tried to design a market where they forgot that citizens are the customers for knowing that your building will stand up. They decided the property developers were the customers and wonder why the buildings fall down. Is there anyone doing it well?
Sure, good question. And look, on the housing market, it's important, and I'm sure that your neighbour there will agree that government housing policy is fundamentally a feature of a democracy. To have house prices level off, to grow slowly, but not to collapse and not to explode. You need in Sydney, the Sydney Basin, about 50,000 new homes built every single year. And any time that government gets close to 50,000 homes each year, everyone freaks out. Everyone complains to their local member and says, "This is crazy. You're building properties in my backyard. This is crazy." And whoever the government is, they'll come along and they'll close that argument down. So, look, you're right, it is a feature of various governments, multiple governments at multiple levels. But it is also a feature of, unfortunately in this case, the democratic will of those people. A government intervention that works, off the top of my head, superannuation. You know, I look at the United States that tears themselves apart every time someone talks about privatising Social Security or anything in that general space. It's the third rail of American politics. We cracked that in the 1980s. And that area, that sector, that economy, that part of the economy has grown and grown and grown. And in doing so, provided fantastic retirement incomes for a generation of people. So I'd say superannuation.
Right, so where do we go?
I'll ask one. I'm going back to Dimitri's point about the inefficiency of bureaucracy. Anyone who's had anything to do, certainly with the state government here in New South Wales, and I suspect the federal government, people who are back office employees of the federal government, and that's most of them, spend their days doing meetings, consultations, etc., but they're not front of line. And a lot of money is wasted there. And it seems to me that what Jim Chalmers could have done was open up a discussion on how we can better manage these partnerships and make the people who are the back office windbags really do something. There is it seems to be in public service, no one cares about outcomes. It's all about where their next promotion's going to be or the next meeting that they have to deliver the minutes for. We have it's Yes Minister all over again. How are we going to get rid of the Yes Minister culture?
Anyone to defend the public service?
Well, I'm going to talk out of school, but I had a chat with the famous, or to some possibly infamous, John Stone once, and he dates it all back to the Dawkins reforms of the early 80s. But it is like Yes Minister. There was a famous episode of Yes Minister where Sir Humphrey and Sir Arnold were talking about public sector, civil service accountability, and Sir Arnold says, this is why we rotate people every 2 to 3 years to stop this accountability nonsense. Well, anyone who's had any dealings with the Commonwealth government, that is literally what goes on in Canberra right now. If you're dealing with any complex public policy issue with the Commonwealth, these things take time to explain. And it's almost like a bell rings after 2.5 years. Rotate, and they hand over to somebody new with no handover, and you have to start again. Now, I'm talking about people who are doing work in social housing. They've had these issues. One person will go to Canberra and they sit in a giant room with 30 to 40 people taking notes. They'd have to start from scratch every time, and lo and behold. Now, how do you fix that? I don't know, but again, I referenced Buchanan and public choice theory. You have to change the incentives. You change the incentives, you change the outcomes. If you reward for outcomes, you might get outcomes.
There's no question that there's a reform piece that you spoke of that would be of great benefit to Australia, no question. That said, I do want to defend the back office public servant for a second. I remember the Carr government introduced into police stations non-police admin workers. They would they worked in a whole series of police stations. I was only in the police portfolio as a staffer very briefly, but at that stage there was about 1,500 of them across New South Wales, and they were a fantastic addition to the police force because they took over a lot of the basic admin laborious work, and they would put the police officers back out on the street so they could be increasingly productive and do so at a much reduced rate. They weren't getting paid the same wages that police officers are. And it's easy to knock public servants. You go through their titles and you think, oh, what does this guy do? This bloke's doing nothing. And then you think to yourself, well, hold on, the PBS, that's chock-a-block filled, or the PBAC, the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee, that's chock-a-block filled with public servants, health economists. What do? They're delivering one of the best value for money pieces of regulation, pieces of purchasing anywhere in the world. Our pharmaceuticals are 30-40% cheaper than anywhere else in the world. That's done largely by back office bureaucrats. In every instance, it's easy to attack them as a straw man and to attack them as an anomaly. But when you go through many of them, they have purpose, they have reason. Now, I'm not defending all of them. I'm not it's the easiest thing in the world to come and find half a dozen that you'd hate to be up here arguing for that job. But on the whole, I'm happy to defend what they do.
May I?
Yes.
I'm happy to defend what they do too, but the Commonwealth Department of Health and Aged Care, I think it's called, has 6,000 employees. Don't run one hospital, don't run one aged care facility. How many of those 6,000 are necessary for the pharmaceutical benefits scheme? Before COVID, if you go to the Department of Health's annual report, they had a number of targeted outcomes, and I'll just highlight two. One of them was pandemic management. One of them was sports diplomacy in conjunction with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. There were more people and resources allocated to sports diplomacy.
Okay, no, sorry, I'll take the bait. I'll take the bait. Sports diplomacy. How imbecilic, how silly. I mean, what sort of a silly person comes up with that idea? Until you think, well, what do sports diplomats do? They get kids playing sport. Why do you want kids playing sport? So that you're not paying for their hip reconstructions that we were talking about earlier. They're not paying for their obesity surgeries. They're not paying for fatty liver transplants. Why do you want kids playing sport? For the public health benefits that they will accrue over a lifetime. That's why you want a sports diplomat.
It wasn't domestic sports diplomacy, it was international sports diplomacy. And again, it's all a question of priorities and relative allocation. As we have seen the cost to the Australian economy of a mismanaged pandemic, I would have rather they spent their money on that rather than sport in the South Pacific.
But here's the thing. Okay. But okay, international sports diplomacy. For years, I played basketball because I watched Michael Jordan in the NBA. I guarantee you that my son wants to be a soccer star because he saw the World Cup, last year, whatever it was. These ideas are ridiculous in the specific until you start examining why do we have that position. Generally speaking, every government, Labor or Liberal, there is generally a reason why you might want something like that floating around a health department.
So this might... It'll be very quick.
I could, but I won't.
Advantage Sam, is it? Lou.
Don't say that, he's going to get angry now.
Thanks, Gerard. I feel like that could have been worthwhile a whole hour, so thanks, guys. But take you back to the question at hand, if I could. One of the things, this is a question for both of you, one of the things that interested me, perhaps more at a macro level, in this discussion about value is that the way we traditionally measure the success of our society has been through sort of hard economic measures. GDP is probably a real obvious one, surplus deficit, total expenditure on transport, whatever it might be. And the notion that we can start to value the impact of government spending through other measures, whether that's the difference that makes in somebody's life or some measurements of what it's done to quality of life or quantity of life might be. Wondering, with that as a wind-up, I guess, and Dimitri, you may have a different view based on... I should say I'm a trained economist as well, so I can say this. So if you've got a different view based on that. But what would you attribute as value? It's probably a question to both of you. If we're looking at success in government, what does value look like? Is this the traditional type of measures that we've done this as we always have, or is this something different?
Well, that's a good way to wind up. So we'll start with Dimitri. Go to Sam.
I'll start with a parallel universe. Imagine at the annual general meeting of BHP, the chairman gets up and says, next year we're going to spend $40 billion. The year after we're going to spend $50 billion. And the year after that we're going to spend $60 billion. And somebody puts up their hand and says, what are we going to get from that? It doesn't matter. We're going to spend 40 more. Imagine the reaction from the community, from the shareholders. We're all shareholders. I completely agree with you. We measure government success the wrong way. We measure by how much we spend, not the outcomes or the outputs, as they would talk about in treasuries. They talk about outcome and output budgeting. It's hard. It's really hard, but if you don't want to do the work, this is the problem. And which is why it's easy for a media grab, for a prime minister, a politician, to get up and say, I announce an extra X million dollars for this. What are we going to get from it? It's not relevant. We're just going to spend more.
That's a great question. There's that Bobby Kennedy quote about GDP that says we measure everything but the things that matter most. We can measure the value of childcare, but we can't measure a mother caring for their child. We measure napalm in his instance, but not the externalities that bring peace. Great question. Don't have a good answer. Jim's trying with his wellness budget. One of the few things in the article that I viscerally disagreed with was him attacking Josh Frydenberg for attacking that, saying that the line from Josh Frydenberg was, well, this is all about yoga retreats and wellness retreats and what nonsense. And he says, well, clearly Josh doesn't realise how many yoga practitioners there were in his own electorate. And as someone who lost an election, that's cruel, man. That's cruel. But look, I think we need to experiment, and that's why I like the article, because it's experimenting with these big ideas, and I think we need people to do that sort of big thinking.
Well, many thanks to Dimitri and many thanks to Sam. I'll be very brief. It's been a very lively discussion tonight and amusing as well. I thought that Jim Chalmers suffered a bit of unfair criticism. I think it's very good that politicians put their ideas in print, and he did it. Kevin Rudd did it some years before. I think Wayne Swan's done it, and some on the coalition side have done it as well. And it's because of that we're having this discussion here tonight. We get a fair idea of what the Treasurer is thinking. We get a critique of what the Treasurer is thinking, and we get a broad support for what the Treasurer is thinking. And I think we've all benefited from that. So well done, Sam. And well done, Dimitri. And thanks to all of you.